1948. A man from a displaced persons camp in Neu-Ulm, Germany, remembers his youth, the 8 years he had to spend in a Soviet exile and then a prison. It was a wonder he'd even stayed alive, because normally in a Soviet prison you either die yourself from starvation or unbearable torture, or the Soviet soldiers help you by shooting a bullet right into your head. Having miraculously saved his life after all those years, the man would write the following about his years of imprisonment. One last thing that you keep after having lost everything and being unable to resist physical and spiritual oppression is laughter, which you hold as a banner to stand by. The man's name was Ivan Bahryany, one of the key Ukrainian novelists of the 20th century. You may wonder, why was it so important for a man who's endured such hardships to keep just one thing, nothing else but laughter? If we look at the history of culture, we can have one interesting observation. It's that laughter often serves as a very powerful way to resist the dominant culture. In the case of Ivan Bahryany, it was the Soviet repressive culture, but we can also see the same phenomenon throughout human history, from ancient Greece and Rome to post-war Europe and post-modern America. In many cases, laughter and humor have a countercultural function, a way to say a word against the established social or political order, to undermine an authority. But when speaking about laughter, we have to keep in mind that in the past people didn't really have memes to laugh at, so they had to send books over WhatsApp, which is the main reason humor and laughter are so well represented in literature. There's irony, satire, burlesque, parody, black humor, absurd, and many more phenomena, each of which has a very different way to undermine the dominant culture. This video starts a series where we're going to speak about the history of humor and laughter in literature from classical antiquity to the 21st century. In this one, we are going to focus specifically on the countercultural laughter, and what we are starting with is the birth of satire in some very old, foggy times in Athens. Measuring how far a flea can jump using tiny wax shoes, finding out if a fly buzzes through its mouth or its anus, sitting in a basket suspended from a rope to contemplate the clouds and the sun. Sounds like a bad trip. It does, but it's actually from Aristophanes' comedy The Clouds, written in the 5th century BC, when most people had marble instead of skin. This play is one of the first examples of satire in European literature, and the events here revolve around the educational institution called the Thinkery, at the head of which is the Greek philosopher Socrates, but which actually serves to mock the Greek philosophy of sophism. By the time of Aristophanes, sophism got to indicate the ability to manipulate other people using words and some very perverted logic. Sophists were seen as people who do not really seek the truth, but rather want to create truth of their own to gain some personal benefits or get political influence. This relativist position is exactly what Aristophanes tries to mock in his play. In one of the episodes, the main character, an elderly father, sends his son to study sophism at the Thinkery because he notices that most people in the city government are actually sophists. But the Thinkery overcomes the man's expectations because when his son graduates, he starts to beat his father and expel him out of the house. The man is shocked, but the boy uses his new skills from the Thinkery and provides an extremely logical argumentation for why sons have the right to beat their fathers, and mothers too. In the end, the old man can't endure this any longer, and he goes to burn down the whole place. So this comedy play is a way to mock the dominant pseudo-philosophical trends in society. We can see something similar in Aristophanes' other play called The Wasps, where the action revolves around a house that's covered by a net, because the man inside has a very harmful addiction. You might think it is wine or some crazy olive weed, but actually his addiction is judging. He just loves sitting in court and telling people what they'll get for not giving a penny for the old guy Zeus. But he can't do that because he is imprisoned. In fact, he wants to run away so much that the guards are afraid he can escape via the bath drain. But that was a stupid suggestion, right? Because the man eventually escapes via the chimney. The whole play is actually criticizing the corrupt politician Cleon from Athens, who was also sort of a sophist and who was manipulating the Athenian judges to achieve what he wanted. The main character of the play who is imprisoned is an example of one of the many followers of Cleon in court. So this way satire goes out into the world and starts to deal with more political issues. A very similar type of satire later appeared in ancient Rome in the novel called The Satyricon by Gaius Petronius. It depicts a very libertine environment which includes being tortured by prostitutes, having a party with pigs, eating geese and fish made of pork, having a rope dancing party, having a fake funeral. A lot of the novel's criticism is directed at the host of a lavish party called Trimalchio, who used to be a slave but who now became a rich guy. Trimalchio's name actually became a synonym for the nouveau riche man, which was much later referenced in Francis Scott Fitzgerald's novel The Great Gatsby, one of the working titles of which was exactly Trimalchio. So this play is more of a social satire, and it means that the criticism is directed not only at Trimalchio but also at us, the readers. This seems to be one of the main structural features of satire. On the one hand, it references the laughed at directly, which is Trimalchio in our case, but implicitly it also criticizes the person who laughs, because it's not just Trimalchio who likes to throw up a lavish party and buy a few overpriced trinkets to seem rich or better than he actually is. So, if we think about it, it seems like in this novel we're really losing track of who laughs and what is laughed at, which is a trend that's going to go viral in the next chapter after the fall of Rome. It might seem that back in the Middle Ages all people did was quarter sinners, cry 24/7, sleep in coffins, and think of Christ as a person who never laughed in his life, which was all of course related to the religious context of the time, when the ideal behavior of a righteous person included asceticism and abstinence from bodily pleasures, among which was laughter. Besides, there was also a clear distinction between the regular everyday culture, to which belonged normal people, merchants, peasants, etc., and the church culture with its clergymen, priests and monks. Church culture was clearly dominant. It was imposing some modes of behavior on the regular people, among which was the discouragement of laughter. Though it wasn't always succeeding, which we can see from the custom of carnivals, church culture still managed to keep its dominant position in the hierarchy all throughout the Middle Ages. However, we can notice that in non-religious literature this hierarchy was often undermined. There were attempts to turn the culture upside down and doubt if the church should really be in the dominant position. One of the key examples of such literature was the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. The book is structured as a collection of stories by 24 pilgrims traveling from London to Canterbury. The pilgrims all come from very different backgrounds. There is a knight, a lawyer, a merchant, a monk, a cook, and many more professions. Each of these people had their own stories and views that are sometimes opposite to the others. For example, we can take a look at two tales from the collection where one man, the summoner, and another man, the friar, are stabbing each other in turn to decide who deserves to go to hell. The friar, that is, a monk, criticizes summoners, that is, folk who summon people to court, for being so corrupt that they can make a deal with the devil. At the same time, the summoner criticizes friars for being even more corrupt because they rob people and justify it with religious causes. And we can't even get who is more wrong. It seems like the author himself isn't even present in this argument. He just gives way to the characters. And the same thing happens for the remaining 22 pilgrims. Each has their own story that often criticizes someone, but there is basically no one who has the ultimate truth. If we compare it to the satire we've spoken about before, we can see that in those stories the author is establishing a certain moral grounding according to which the characters are judged, be it the importance of truth in the clouds or the virtue of simple life in the Satyricon. If we have a look at the Canterbury Tales, they don't have this moral grounding because each character has a moral of his own and none of the morals is higher than the others. This has a very interesting consequence because this basically allows Chaucer to bring down the social hierarchy so that the people from the church no longer have any superiority over peasants or tradesmen or merchants. This leads to a rather equal social environment where the characters are no longer laughing at a certain person or a certain group, but are laughing at everyone at the same time. A very similar view on laughter existed in Ukrainian Baroque literature of the 16th, 18th centuries. Already at that time we can see how laughter was key for Ukrainian religious culture, which was opposing the view on Christianity as a sad religion. One of the key Ukrainian philosophers of that time, Grigory Skovoroda, wrote, "Did Christ ever laugh? This question is very similar to this was one. Was the sun ever hot? Naturally, Christ is the son of Abraham himself, Isaac, who is an incarnation of laughter, joy, sweetness, peace, and festivity." Thus laughter was coexisting with the religious discourse of that time, just like it was in Chaucer. But if Chaucer's collection meant to undermine social and church hierarchies, Ukrainian Baroque poetry often undermined the divine ones. It was seeking to bridge the gap between heaven and hell. It mainly works by making deities more human and closer to everyday culture. In the following poem, for example, God is represented as a cool guy who comes to give a thrashing to the devil. Have you fellows ever heard how God himself came to our place? What for? To smash the devil's mug and face and rid the fiend of his 2 eyes. In another poem called Marco of Hell, the famous Ukrainian trickster Marco goes down to Lucifer, who lives in a Ukrainian rural house in hell and drinks horilka with devils who look like cats. You can see here as well that all of these poems are examples of how literature can help join oppositions that exist in society so that even gods and devils don't seem to be too unattainable or distant, thus breaking the hierarchies established by the dominant culture of the time. If we take a trip from Ukraine to the 17th century Spain and visit a local pub in Madrid, we can meet one ingenious gentleman who has a bit of a different authority to disagree with. With little sleep and much reading, his brains got so dry that he lost his wits. No, it's not about me, it's about Don Quixote, the first pop star of Spanish culture. Indeed, reading from which he cracked up is at the core of Miguel de Cervantes' novel, because what the noble knight reads are chivalric romances, which were like Game of Thrones but for people who couldn't afford a TV set. These romances that were viral at that time seem to be the objects of Cervantes' satire themselves, which is an interesting case because in the previous examples we looked at, the author was satirizing something from the real world, be it a definite person, a social type, or an institution. This time the criticism is directed at the fictional world and at made-up stories. Cervantes here wants to expose the superficiality, pretentiousness, and the clichés of the whole genre, which can be seen in the passages that Don Quixote particularly seemed to like in those novels. The reason of the unreason with which my reason is afflicted so weakens my reason that with reason I murmur at your beauty, or the high heavens, that of your divinity, divinely fortify you with the stars, render you deserving of the desert your greatness deserves. Having read those kinds of books, Don Quixote believes himself to be part of this fiction. He wants to go out into the world, defeat its giants, and save beautiful princesses. But the world turns out to be something different than Don Quixote thinks it to be. the giants are turned into mills and beautiful princesses are no more than peasant girls from Spanish villages. This seems to be a great illustration of one of the key theories of laughter, the mismatch theory. According to it, we laugh when we encounter a mismatch between what is expected and what actually happens. Immanuel Kant was saying something similar when he defined laughter as an effect that arises if a tense expectation is transformed into nothing. So in the case of Don Quixote, we and the main character himself expect the world to resemble the world of chivalric romances, but in the end it turns out to be something quite different. This way, by using comic mismatch and parody, Cervantes manages to say a word against the established literary culture. But we also have to keep in mind that this mismatch creates a paradox inside the novel, because at the same time as we perceive the whole story in a humorous, comic way, we also understand that Don Quixote himself is a tragic character who we can sympathize with. That's why Cervantes' novel goes much further than just criticizing the tradition of the chivalric romance, as it often borders on the edge between irony and seriousness. Oftentimes, Don Quixote is idealized despite being a laughingstock for other characters in the novel. Because of this, there are so many interpretations of this work that range from reading Don Quixote as a satire and parody to seeing it as an authentic Spanish scripture which replaces Christ with our Lord Don Quixote, as Miguel de Unamuno once wrote. This multitude of interpretations is what makes the work timeless. It used to be contemporary in the 17th century, just as it feels contemporary today. If you want another video on how exactly Cervantes' novel speaks to us today and what it can teach us, let me know in the comments below. In the meantime, we are making our last trip into the Ukrainian steppe of the end of the 18th century, where a twin brother of the founder of Rome, Aeneas, lived. Aeneas was a lively fellow, lusty as any Cossack blade, in every kind of mischief mellow, the staunchest tramp to ply his trade. These are the opening lines of one of the most important poems in Ukrainian literature, the Aeneid, written by Ivan Kotlarevsky. It is a humorous retelling of the ancient Roman poem of the same name, written by Virgil. The story there goes as follows. After the Greeks have managed to burn down Troy, some of the Trojans escape, being led by the hero Aeneas. After a lot of adventures, which included dumping the queen of Carthage, Dido, visiting the underworld and fighting a few wars, Aeneas arrives in Italy, where he founds the Roman nation, being an ancestor of Romulus, after whom the city of Rome was named. So for Virgil in ancient Rome, this poem was a way to make a direct line of descendancy between the burnt city of Troy and the glorious Roman nation. He was trying to historically justify that the Roman Empire had every right to be an empire in the first place because of having such a great ancestor. This poem became seminal for Western European literature, getting a lot of attention at schools and universities in the later historical periods. It was studied as an example of classical Latin from the 1st century AD, which was the golden age of Rome. It became a canonical work of literature, and each time a canonical work of literature appears, there come numerous attempts to make fun of it. For the Aeneid, these attempts started in the 17th century with the publication of the travested Aeneid by Giovanni Battista Lalli in 1633, leading to more humorous rewritings in French, German or English literatures, along with the Ukrainian poem by Ivan Kotlarevsky, published in 1798. All of these works use something that we nowadays call burlesque, which can be defined as an incongruous imitation, a work that imitates the manner of a serious literary work, but makes the imitation amusing by a ridiculous disparity between the manner and the matter. If we take Kotlarevsky's poem, the matter here is exactly the same. Aeneas, a glorious young man, sets out to build a new home after his home city of Troy has been burned down. But the manner in which all this is written makes a huge contrast, because instead of the sophisticated language and high-flown descriptions in the original, we get common folk language and at least a few dozen descriptions of how Aeneas and his crew love eating dumplings, cakes, puffy rolls, borscht, bread, beetroot, mushrooms, eggs, berries, fish soup, pork, chicken, ducks, and lambs, nothing of which is ever eaten without a glass of horilka or wine. It feels like what Aeneas is going to found is not Rome, but a doner kebab. And the same kind of burlesque is used when speaking about the gods. This, for example, is how Juno is described, who was the queen of the Roman gods. But Juno, daughter of a bitch, a cackling hen with fighting edge. And you can read the same kind of stuff in most of the rewritings of Virgil's original poem. However, what makes the Ukrainian version stand out is that it's not just burlesque, it's not just trying to mock and deconstruct the original text, but it also tries to build something new or recreate something long forgotten. Kotlarevsky's poem is making a parallel between Roman and Ukrainian history, because just as it happened with Virgil's Aeneas, Ukrainians also had their home burned. In the 17th, 18th centuries, there were a lot of conflicts between Moscovia, which later took the name Russia, and the Ukrainian Cossacks, military troops living in the steppe and on the so-called Syches, fortified settlements around the Dnipro River. In 1708, the Moscow troops were ordered to seize the capital of the Cossacks, Baturin, burn it down and murder all of its inhabitants. More than a century later, in 1775, Moscovia destroyed the last siege on the Dnipro River, thus making a lot of former Cossacks flee and seek new homes somewhere far away. It is very likely that in his poem Kotlarevsky refers exactly to these events, because the original Trojans are very often called Cossacks here. They eat Ukrainian food and wear Ukrainian clothes. By making this parallel, the author wants to give a hope to the Ukrainian people to someday get their statehood back, which was relevant in the 19th century, just as it was relevant for the Ukrainian immigrants who were fleeing the Soviet Union in the 20th century, and which finally came true with the Declaration of Independence of Ukraine in 1991. So we can say that Kotlarevsky's The Aeneid is both destructive and constructive in its function. It is destructive in its attempt to overthrow the literary canon by mocking one of the key works of European literature, and it is constructive in the way that it gives a basis for the development of the national identity by immortalizing folk language, traditions, and the culture of the Cossacks. Thank you all for watching this. It was the first part of our series of videos on the history of laughter in literature. In the next part, we're going to speak about the 20th century, when laughter, though still serving the countercultural function, goes a bit wrong, giving birth to the theatre of absurd, black humour, and the phenomenon of play in postmodern literature. So if you've liked this video, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next episode, and write a comment below. Preferably with a few jokes.